Hello everybody and welcome back to Learn Hittite, and today we'll be talking about the feminine gender in Indo-European and trying to figure out if we can detect its presence in the Anatolian branch. So this is by far the most ambitious video that I've ever tried to make, and it would be impossible of me to try and cover over 100 years of academic research on this subject matter in such a video format. However, what I will do is take a look at the most pertinent research from the past 20 or 30 years and try and present that to you today. Now, during this video, I'm probably going to put a lot of information on the screen. So during those moments, please be prepared to pause the video, read, analyze, ingest the information that's presented before moving on. Now, one of my goals of this video is also to try and keep the subject matter as open to all people as possible. The original idea behind the Learn Hittite channel was to encourage people, perhaps people who have no background in linguistics, to study and learn ancient languages like Hittite. And I want to keep some of that philosophy in today's video and make it as approachable for as many people as possible. Now, in order to do that, in some areas I might have to compromise on my explanations, but I will always link the material where I'm taking these ideas from, so people who want to take a deeper dive can go and read up on it. So, first things first, what exactly do we mean when we talk about gender? Well, firstly, grammatical gender isn't simply the process of taking a word and modifying it somehow so it refers specifically to something feminine. When we talk about grammatical gender, we're referring to a process whereby the noun and appropriate pronouns or adjectives modify themselves to agree with the form of the noun that they are modifying. So for example, in English, we could say, this great queen. We have a demonstrative in this, we have an adjective in great, and we have a feminine noun in queen. Now, if I was to say, this great king, the demonstrative and the adjective would stay in the same form. There is no agreement between a masculine noun and a feminine noun. However, in Polish language, for example, this great queen would be ta wielka królowa versus ten wielki król in the masculine form. Now we can see that the demonstratives in Polish change their forms depending on whether they're agreeing with a feminine noun or a masculine noun. This is what we mean by gender. In Hittite, we would have the expression, for example, this great queen would be kas salis hasusaras, and this great king would be kas salis hasus. So whilst Hittite has the ability to change king and make it feminine in hasusaras, we don't have the same agreement with the demonstrative and the adjective like we do in Polish. And this is what has led many linguists to state that Anatolian, the language branch that Hittite sits on, doesn't have the feminine gender. So what about gender in Proto-Indo-European? Well, in order to tell that story, I'm going to tell you the beginning and I'm going to tell you the end of the story, because these two parts are where linguists generally have the most agreement. It's the middle part of that story where things get a little bit crazy. So let's go over the beginning and the end of the story. So it's known that most ancient Indo-European languages maintain three genders, or at least have traces of it. However, from the beginning of the discussion on the origin of gender in Indo-European, it was noticed by scholars that the feminine gender appears to be a relatively late innovation. Therefore, it's believed that early Proto-Indo-European possessed a two-gender system, differentiated on the base of animacy, amongst other things like individuation. However, it wasn't as clear-cut as all things are animate, or as one linguist described, with liveliness, are put into one gender, and all things that are inanimate are put into another gender. In fact, there appeared to be a kind of like continuum of animacy, and there was a cut-off point towards the lower end of animacy, and things that exceeded that cut-off point were put in the inanimate gender, and things that did not exceed that cut-off point stuck in the animate gender. The inanimate group, which became associated with the neuter gender, had the lowest level of animacy and individuation. And now we get to the end part of the story, which is basically from this animate-inanimate gender system, with the inanimate being associated with the neuter gender, we had the feminine gender arise, and we were left with a three-gender system in Indo-European. This feminine gender, including nouns and agreements, such as adjectives and particles, were being formed with a suffix involving the second laryngeal. It is believed that this suffix was originally used in the formation of abstract nouns derived from verbs. Interestingly, and some would say critically, it also gave rise to the inflectional ending of neuter nouns in the nominative and accusative case. The extension of this suffix into the neuter was explained as resulting from the infection of neuter plural and collective forms by the abstract suffix involving the second laryngeal. So yeah, in the beginning there were two genders, animate, inanimate. Inanimate was associated with the neuter, and then somehow we had this second laryngeal suffix that melded itself onto certain nouns and agreements, and the third gender, the feminine gender, was created. However, how we got from A to C is what linguists debate and argue about. And to be honest, in my opinion, that debate is still open. I don't actually think we have a satisfactory explanation for how Proto-Indo-European or Indo-European went from the two gender system to the three gender system. But there are some very interesting hypotheses out there. What are some of the arguments regarding that middle part of the story? Well, some linguists support a proposition put forward in an extremely well thought out book by Croatian academic Ranko Matasoic, who in 2004 proposed that the feminine gender in Proto-Indo-European resulted from a split within the inanimate gender. This resulted in a three-gender system of animate, inanimate abstract or collective nouns, and inanimate concrete, or what is now known as the masculine gender, the feminine gender, and the neuter gender. Matasoic believes that the feminine gender derived from the inanimate gender, in part by the fact that the second laryngeal suffix was also present in the inflectional ending of neuter nouns in the nominative and the accusative. Now, the Anatolian languages have no overt representation of a feminine gender. Anatolian has a two-gender system, common and neuter. And one of the key problems in terms of understanding the rise of the feminine gender in Indo-European is that Anatolian doesn't overtly have the feminine gender, but it does have this second laryngeal suffix as a nominative and accusative neuter plural. So scholars therefore believed that this suffix must have extended itself to these neuter plurals first and then to the feminine gender second. And in Anatolian what would have happened is that Anatolian was present in the Indo-European dialect continuum when that first part of the process happened, but wasn't present when the second laryngeal was extended as a feminine gender. So, and people have basically been trying to explain how did this extension to the feminine gender happen. And Matasovic's theory, alongside Ticher, believed that this jump occurred due to the influence of some feminine collective nouns. However, this theory doesn't necessarily hold water because there are no traces of feminine collectives attested anywhere in the Indo-European languages. In 2009, Silvia Luraghi proposed a different solution to the problem of the rise of the feminine gender in Indo-European. Luraghi actually published two papers in 2009, both concerning the feminine gender in Indo-European, and the second one builds upon the first one. But her proposal can be boiled down as such. She agrees that there was an animate and inanimate gender, and that these two genders then split into three: common, abstract, and neuter, with the abstract gender drawing nouns from both the animate and inanimate gender of the previous two-gender system. Subsequently, this three-gender system of common, abstract, and neuter went under another reconfiguration to a second stage three-gender system of masculine, feminine, and neuter. This time, the feminine gender, the new feminine gender, drew from nouns from the previous common and abstract genders. Now, Luraghi states that this original split of the animate and inanimate genders into the first stage of the three-gender system was motivated by abstraction, and that the subsequent reconfiguration into the three-gender system of masculine, feminine, and neuter was motivated by sex. But Luraghi's explanation that the feminine gender ultimately derived as a subdivision of the animate gender via the abstract gender still doesn't solve the question why this particular suffix was associated with the feminine. Luragi answers the question as such, and her ideas are also built on ideas that were put forward by Matasoic, that when it comes to living beings, the animacy versus inanimacy contrast is rather activity versus inactivity, and specifically the activity or the ability to participate in the reproductive process. Luragi notes, for example, that many animate objects that can't participate in the reproductive process, for example young humans or young animals, are often considered neuter gender. And she states that if procreation is an important factor in this system, that the tendency of such a system, when a new morphologically suitable noun class was made available, was to immediately associate that with the feminine rather than for the gender to be associated with abstraction, as in the first stage of the system. At this point itself, the suffix became reinterpreted as a marker of the feminine gender. Most linguists these days either throw their weight behind Matasoic's proposal or Luragi's proposal regarding the rise of the feminine gender, or in many cases some kind of amalgamation of both of them. Now, is it true that the Anatolian branch really doesn't show any evidence of the feminine gender? Well, it's almost universally agreed that it doesn't overtly maintain a three-gender system. However, there are three possible explanations regarding why this might be. First is that Anatolian simply lost the third gender in a similar way to English has a reduced form of the three-gender system today. However, the attested Anatolian languages are far more archaic, and the expectation is that one would still expect to see some evidence of the three-gender system present in Anatolian. Many people see zero evidence of this, and others see only minute traces. Others, like Luragi for example, maintain that the Anatolian branch doesn't have a third gender because it never had a third gender. It wasn't part of the Proto-Indo-European dialect continuum when this innovation took place. A third argument, however, may be that Anatolian broke away during the process of the formation of the feminine, leaving perhaps some rather obscure, unelaborated traces. Work concerning the presence, or lack thereof, of the feminine gender in Anatolian has been undertaken pretty much since the languages were discovered and deciphered. However, today we'll just consider some of the ideas put forward by mainstream linguists over the past 30 or so years. Melchert in 1992, building on his previous work and the analysis of others, concluded that the early pi system of animate and inanimate, gender was distinguished only in the accusative and nominative, and that the feminine was subsequently divided by the use of the second laryngeal suffixes. So nothing necessarily new here. Melchert, however, also concluded that a category of I stem suffixes in Hittite, observable in the nominative and accusative, reflect the first stage of the feminine gender development in Proto-Indo-European, which only affected the nominative and accusative before expanding throughout the paradigm in the second phase. Anatolian, however, was not affected by the second phase, presumably because it had already broken away from the core Proto-Indo-European group. By 2014, however, Melchert had completely walked back on these claims in his prior paper on the Proto-Indo-European second laryngeal suffix, and more than once during the 2014 paper, Melchert explicitly states that Anatolian never possessed a feminine gender. However, he does keep a few arguments from his previous 1992 work open for interpretation. For example, some of the potential evidence for the second laryngeal suffixes in Lycian. And additionally, the limited, although really eye-catching evidence for possible adjective agreement. Melchert generally throughout the 2014 paper disagrees with Matasoic and aligns himself more with the work of Luragi. Melchert states that the Proto-Indo-European second laryngeal was present in Anatolian, just serving other functions as suffixes forming nouns in the animate gender. And Melchert goes on to agree with the work presented in both of Luragi's 2019 papers on the issue. He, in particular, agrees with the fact that the feminine gender split from the animate, and he shows admiration for Luragi's use of cross-linguistic data to demonstrate that on high animacy levels, sex becomes that next differentiating factor. We've already spoken about this. Hence the natural creation of a feminine gender once a sufficient lexical and morphological means had been created. Kim, in his 2014 paper on the feminine in Indo-European, but this time from a Tocharian perspective, also agrees with Laragi's point of view that the Indo-European feminine derived from the animate and formed an intermediary between the masculine and neuter genders in terms of individuation. Kim notes the presence of the second laryngeal in Anatolian, but too states that it isn't indicative of a fully formed feminine gender, merely that Anatolian inherited the ability to use the second laryngeal as a derivation or suffix for female reference. Okay, so what about evidence for the feminine gender in the Anatolian languages? Well, I can tell everybody now that the evidence is severely limited, but it is interesting nonetheless. Here I've got an inscription for us to take a look at today, and this was first observed by in a paper by Melchert, which I will leave the details to on the screen and in the video description box. And I want to draw everybody's attention to the final part of this inscription here, where we have the words Malia Ereyupama, or actually Ereyuama is written. Malia Ereyupama. Malia here is the name of a goddess. And this adjective here, Ereyupama, is describing Malia. Melchert states here that the ending ama would be the feminine nominative singular of the participle ami. The translation of Ereyupama would be exalted. So in all we would have the exalted Malia. But what's key here is we have this feminine ama ending agreeing with the noun Malia. Pretty interesting, right? Now, in Melchert's paper, he does give other examples. I'm not going to show all of them here, but this is just one example of what Melchert originally suspected could have been evidence of the feminine gender in Anatolian. He doesn't give information whether he suspects this form was actually inherited from Proto-Indo-European or whether it was developed later. But still, nonetheless, we seem to have some form of feminine agreement in an Anatolian language. And as I said, in later articles, in later research work, Melchert walks back from this proposal, this opinion. However, it's there, right? I mean, I understand that the evidence is limited, but there is something here. Now, of course, it could always be a scribal mistake or an innovation or something like that. But equally, I don't think that we can disregard it just at a drop of a hat. And what's more important is that I noticed in subsequent articles, Melchert doesn't really attempt to give an additional explanation for this and other potential feminine agreement forms. There's also another potential piece of evidence for the feminine in the Anatolian branch presented in Chlorcourt's second excursus, Canesite Asue and the feminine gender in Hittite and Proto-Indo-European. In this paper, the element Asue is discussed because it's often used in Hittite to form feminine personal names. Now, of course, on its own, this doesn't mean that Hittite had traces of the three-gender system. However, it's also believed that the element Asue is actually an adjective, and this then would have significant consequences because it would be a form of agreement between a feminine adjective and a feminine noun. Chlorcourts does state in the article that the final E in Asue is ultimately derived from the Proto-Indo-European feminizing second laryngeal. And the story gets a little bit more complicated though, because in Hittite you would use the adjective asus to describe both males and females if you were to use it as an independent adjective. Now the issue is that when it seems to be compounded into a name, that it takes on this feminizing E, which derived from the second laryngeal. Now the question is, did a standalone feminine adjective, asue, ever exist in Hittite? Chlorcourts seems to think that not, and that merely the usage of asue in name forms represents an implementation of this I motion suffix in order to designate the name as a feminine name. Clarkor states that the presence of this asua in feminine names simply is indicative of the fact that Anatolian probably split off during that period of the creation of the feminine gender, where the second laryngeal possessed a form as a motion suffix but hadn't yet evolved into a full three-way gender system. Clarkor states, and I will quote, that we may assume that Anatolian split off from the Proto-Indo-European mother language before the suffix I second laryngeal required its new function as an agreement marker. This latter development, the outcome of which can be seen in all other ancient Indo-European languages, may then be viewed as a common innovation of the non-Anatolian branches, which would then constitute an argument in favour of the Indo-Anatolian hypothesis. So, some people asked me to make this video based on a video that I made discussing the Indo-Anatolian or the Indo-Hittite hypothesis. And I reject the Indo-Hittite, Indo-Anatolian hypothesis simply because I think it's a question of renaming things that doesn't necessarily serve a purpose. And I also stated in that video that the question around the feminine gender in Anatolian hasn't been fully answered. And I do kind of maintain that position today. I think that there is some interesting examples of potential evidence, as we've discussed, of the feminine gender in Anatolian. Now, for sure, the Anatolian branch never had a fully developed three-gender system, in my opinion. I don't think it ever developed one. I don't think it's a case that it lost it. However, the basic ingredients needed to form the feminine gender were there, and we can see traces of that. So I disregard the Indo-Anatolian hypothesis or the Indo-Hittite hypothesis, which is basically, and I suggest people go back and watch that video or Google what the Indo-Anatolian, Indo-Hittite hypothesis is, simply because I think we still need to group Anatolian with the core Indo-European languages because it was part of that process. And half the time when you read many of these papers concerning gender in Proto-Indo-European, we have to talk about the Anatolian languages. And because they provide, alongside Tocharian, a lot of the more interesting new evidence that's been established as opposed to those classic ancient Indo-European languages that are studied. The Anatolian languages ultimately were part of that process which gave Indo-European languages the feminine gender. They just weren't part of the whole process. And as I already presented in this video, there are still some interesting traces that I think are well worth investigating and worthy of further consideration. Well, this was Learn Hittite, and I truly hope that you found this video on the Proto-Indo-European and Anatolian feminine enjoyable and informative. Of course, if you have any questions or comments, please drop them down below. Don't forget to give us a like and a subscribe and do all of that good stuff for the algorithm. As always, it was an honour to talk to you today. That's all from me. Goodbye for now.